Hello everyone and welcome to Caroline Nutrition. This is episode 5, Alzheimer's, a well-sweetened brain. I'm your host Ian Cath and I'm the one with the interesting questions to help us have the best that food has to give, health, vitality and enjoyment. And to help us make some sense of all the information out there, I'm joined with Caroline Scott, nutritionalist and dietitian, and the person with the answers to your questions. Hello Caroline, welcome to episode 5.
Thanks Ian, how are you going?
I've had a cold, terrible cold. It's nailed me, but I'm pretty well over it now, so that's why we're doing this episode. Looking forward to, well, actually not really looking forward to it. It's Alzheimer's. Not a particularly comfortable conversation, but something that we have to have, I imagine.
Yeah, it is rather, isn't it? It's pretty topical at the moment, though, so I thought it was about time we rolled it out.
And has it got something to do with this whole inflammation thing?
Well, funny you should ask that. Because yes, are you denoting a common thread?
I'm noticing something.
Yes, so even way back to episode 1 when we talked about inflammation, and we even mentioned at that point that inflammation can lead to Alzheimer's, and I felt it was time to roll that one out. Yes, so inflammation very much is behind and beneath, so we'll talk about that.
Okay, good. Yeah, I don't know, like a lot of these topics, as I've mentioned previously, I don't know anything about Alzheimer's either. Unfortunately, we don't have any dementia in our family, so I'm quite lucky. What about yourself, Caroline?
It always begs that whole thing of, not that anyone's confessed to or admits to. No, as far as I'm aware, we don't. And I guess that's one of the first points to make, is that so far we have considered Alzheimer's as very much a genetic disorder. And we now know from the current research and the more up-to-date research that, yes, sure, there is a genetic component, but it's not the major one. And it's certainly not written in stone that just if you do have the genetic tendency, because there are specific genes for this, it does not necessarily mean that you will end up with Alzheimer's. Or
vice versa, if you've got no heritage of it in your family, there's no guarantee that you won't get it?
Oh yeah, that's right. So it's very much a lifestyle disease, as we're beginning to discover, rather than it being stuck in your genetics, which we've considered before.
Okay, well that's something that is very new to me. I've always thought of as something that you were genetically predisposed towards.
Yeah, and that's been the thinking. So it's forgivable. Everyone has thought that, and even in science and medical research, that's what we've considered. And it's only in the last, I suppose, 10 years that we've started to see that the genetics are not written in stone as we thought. And so the subject of epigenetics has become more valid and more researched and more widely available. And we have a better understanding now that there are many things around us that affect our genes. So just because we have that set of genetics doesn't mean that we will, get the outcome of those genes, whether it be Alzheimer's or diabetes or indeed some other condition. So yeah, epigenetics has much more of a thing to play.
Okay, well, let's wind it back a little bit then before we get too far down this rabbit hole. So we're going to be talking about Alzheimer's. So a lot of people talk about it. I've got Alzheimer's disease, as some people say. How would you define it? What is it? And I did mention dementia earlier. So can we talk about the two different terms?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Alzheimer's and dementia are linked. Obviously, there's an aspect of Alzheimer's that looks like dementia, but they're actually relatively different. So dementia is something that tends to happen much, much later. Alzheimer's is something that can hit quite early, in your 60s even. But dementia tends to be a more of an aged related, so it'll kick in later. And Alzheimer's definitely has a progression. Dementia seems to be a little more varied. But Alzheimer's, they have done an awful lot of research on, particularly recently, the research that's coming out is quite amazing. And it's many scientists now are calling Alzheimer's diabetes type 3. There is so much evidence of there being inflammation in the brain from our insulin and glucose imbalance, which is the kind of thing that you see in diabetes. So it quite rightly is being referred to as diabetes type 3.
So diabetes, I think of, as we discussed previously, insulin levels, people injecting themselves with artificial insulin, pancreas, all that sort of thing. That's a long way from what I normally think of as far as a brain disorder.
Yeah, absolutely. The common thread, what's holding it together here and creating the parallel, is the inflammatory potential that's beneath everything. So remember right back in episode 1 when we talked about inflammation and how inflammation undercuts everything and can be a causative factor in many disorders. So there are so many of these disorders that are actually created through inflammation in the body, in the brain. It doesn't really matter where it is. Your body, brain is inflamed, and then there are consequences. And so in a way, we often just look at the symptoms and we forget to look at the underlying triggers. So what's actually causing the symptoms, and what we're finding is what's causing the symptoms is inflammation. So it's inflammation that's creating these disorders, but we're not seeing that because we're only focusing on the symptoms. So the symptoms are for example, the amyloid plaque that they've discovered in the brain of people that have Alzheimer's. So they felt that it was amyloid plaque that was causing Alzheimer's, but what they're realizing now is it's not. Amyloid plaque is created in the brain in reaction to inflammation. And the inflammation that desperately is getting into the brain is the exposure of the brain to so much blood sugar or blood glucose and a subsequent increase in insulin and insulin resistance. And so that's creating a mega amount of inflammation in the brain, creating amyloid plaque as a protective factor. So we've always thought that amyloid plaque was something that was really terrible. But actually, if you look at it from a different perspective, it's trying to protect the brain from damage. And so the more amyloid plaque you've got, the more protection, because obviously the brain thinks it needs more protection, but it actually needs protecting from the blood glucose levels. And we've got blood glucose levels because of our diet and our dietary choices.
And the plaque is the body trying to deal with it, but the plaque doesn't help and fix the problem.
No, it's only a protective thing, so it's creating a coating, and then obviously you can't get the proper electrical firing that you need between neurons to actually create thinking, to create thought, to have memory, to all of those things. And so what we see commonly in Alzheimer's is that loss of memory. It's not the old-term memory, but the short-term memory. So skills that we might have only just learnt, names, events in your diary for the last few weeks, days, maybe a couple of months. But it's not the long-term memories that we lose. We do eventually in Alzheimer's, but initially it's not. So yeah, the amyloid plaque, it's almost like putting a blanket, I guess you could imagine, putting a blanket over your brain. So you can't actually, all the wiring's not talking to each other anymore. And so things are miswiring. And eventually, as the amyloid plaque increases, that misfiring just becomes worse.
I remember before I met you, Caroline, that I remember hearing about what people referred to as micro strokes happening in the brain. And as these tiny little bleeds happened, they eventually turned into plaques and proteins, which they suspected were the slow build-up of these plaques that caused Alzheimer's. I'm now starting to wonder if they weren't micro strokes, micro bleeds, but they're actually the end result of this problem that you're describing. Do you think there's something in that?
I'm not entirely sure. There would definitely be some connection. In terms of like little micro bleeds, I'm not sure that they're leading to amyloid plaque buildup. But obviously something is going on in the brain at that point, whether it's the cardiovascular system that's creating that or what it is, I don't exactly know. I've not read that that's got to do a lot with Alzheimer's, but there could be some research out there that shows that I'm wrong.
So it seems that inflammation is the problem. Where's this inflammation coming from?
Well, as we're suggesting, and the research, the most recent research is suggesting that the inflammation is coming pretty much where the inflammation is coming from in most disorders. It's coming from being attacked by the level of blood glucose, the excess of blood glucose in the blood system, and the subsequent rise of insulin. So you get insulin because the body is trying to clear the excess blood glucose from the blood. You can't leave blood glucose in the blood for too long because it's quite damaging to your arterial system. So the body's negative feedback system is to produce and release insulin, which helps to feed all of the blood glucose into those tissue cells that actually want the glucose to create energy out of. So we need the glucose. The brain needs the glucose. All the cells in the body need glucose. But when there's an excess, we actually have a problem. So when you've eaten foods and you've created blood glucose, all of your little cells want to be fed. And so insulin helps that process so that it speeds the delivery of glucose from the blood into your little cells. But if you've eaten the wrong kind of foods or overeaten, so we have a glut of glucose, we can't just allow that to whiz around the body and damage the cardiovascular system. So insulin does its job really well, and it makes sure that it stores all of that glucose. And if you can't stuff any more into all of your little cells or into your brain, it will stick it into the liver and it will stick it into fat cells. And this is where often overeating certain types of food, and not necessarily the foods we're thinking, will actually lead to weight gain when we might even be on a weight loss diet or over-exercising in order to lose weight. So it's that excess of glucose. And then when that continues on a regular basis, not just one day or one meal or something, but when we're doing this consistently, day in, week in, month in, year in, you're actually creating damage in the body, because you get to a point where your cells can no longer cope with the amount of glucose and insulin that's being required. So you end up needing more insulin. You end up producing more insulin to deal with the same level of glucose that you used to deal with quite effectively. But because you've been doing it, it's like a wearing out kind of mechanism. So your body cells wear out and they just cannot cope with the level of glucose that you're asking them to. So it needs more insulin to do this, and that creates a disorder called insulin resistance. And now we're seeing a glut. There's too much glucose getting through the blood-brain barrier, and we're having to really work hard to reduce that glucose, and that creates inflammation.
So how do we fix this? How do we fix this problem?
Well, we fix it in the way that we fix all of the problems when they're associated with inflammation. So we have to go back to those strategies that we had in episode 1, really. So we're looking at, we need to alter the diet. Researchers are showing us, and science is showing us, Alzheimer's is completely preventable and reversible. In certain cases, not in all, but in certain cases, particularly if you catch it early enough. But obviously prevention, as we know, is always better. So we need to change the diet. There are a few other lifestyle factors that are involved. And in fact, I don't know if anyone caught it, but Catalyst did a great show on this recently.
This is a science program here in Australia on the ABC.
Yeah, and it's you can. I'm sure they've got some catalogues that you can actually look at it online. But it brilliantly showed how by changing our diet, by looking at your exercise program, and by regulating your sleep, those 3 factors made a massive difference in the reduction of Alzheimer's and reversing your risk and the incidence of Alzheimer's. So again, it's looking at simple strategies, looking at your diet and how we can change that. We need to reduce our reliance on carbohydrate-based foods that give us high glucose levels. We really seriously need to look at that. We need to make sure we're eating enough good anti-inflammatory foods in our diet, and we need to examine the inflammatory-based foods that we've got and reduce those as well. If we did all those things in our diet, if we made sure we exercised and moved our body every day and we had great sleep, our incidence of Alzheimer's is affected by something amazing like 60%.
So if you have a family history of Alzheimer's and you basically were terrified of maybe having this condition later in life, it sounds like it'd be a pretty wise idea to be proactive so that you don't increase your chance of developing it.
Yeah, be proactive, because the other thing the scientists are saying is that this condition starts to formulate 20 years out. So if it's a condition that appears in many people's brains at the age of 60, you've got to start thinking about this before you hit 40. And you've got to start making changes before you hit 40. And if you don't, you can make changes anyway, because you can still reduce the pressure on the brain, and you can still reverse a lot of the inflammation and the damage that's done. But if you don't, and if you wait until you actually get signs, sure, you can still, negate some, but it really is, it's a matter of the horses bolted. We've really got to start talking about this much, much younger.
So in a way, you shouldn't even be looking whether mum and dad have got this condition. You should be looking whether your grandparents have got it. And if your grandparents have got it, start acting on it when you're in your 20s.
Oh, completely.
That'd be a far more sensible way to approach it.
Yeah, very much. Start acting on it in your 20s. That would be the greatest thing. Have you ever tried talking to people in their 20s and suggesting that long-term, changes in their diet would really help with their long-term health?
Yeah, some people listen, but mainly not. Mainly not. They normally have to have some wake-up call even at that young age.
Yeah.
As happened to me.
I must admit, there have been many clients and many people that I've spoken to and I've had the pleasure of presenting to in their 20s, and they're really switched on these days. And so people definitely are making different choices, and that's great. But yes, we need to start making changes and better choices as early as possible.
So that sort of sorts out the whole genetic and epigenetics side of things. And what if you just, I suppose, continuing on from that, even if there is no history, like in your family and my family, is there still incidents of people randomly getting it because they've been living a hard lifestyle?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you increase your risk factor. You increase the risk factors, obviously, by having the genes. There's a particular gene. Don't ask me what it's called again. They've got very complicated names. But if you've got that gene set, then we know that you've got a higher percentage risk factor developing Alzheimer's. But even if you don't have that gene set, a big risk factor is obviously as you age. So the older you get, was I reading recently, as you hit 80, your risk of Alzheimer's almost doubles. If you're someone who does no regular movement, so you don't exercise regularly, your risk increases. If you're someone who has how shall we call this? I hope mum's not listening. If you have a tea and toast diet, then your risk increases. So this means if your diet is really pretty devoid of any green stuff or fibre and you have way too much carbohydrate, think processed breads, sugars, pasta, rice, grain, that kind of thing. If you have a lot of those in your diet and not enough greens and fibre, then your risk increases. If you're someone who doesn't sleep well and has had sleep disorders or never slept that well throughout your life, again, that increases your risk. But one of the biggest ones is exercise. So the recent stuff was showing, even just by getting out and doing a daily exercise routine, even if it's a brisk walk for 20 minutes, half an hour, that decreases your risk. There can be some really, really simple things that we can do, which I think is quite simple. Getting out for a bit of a brisk walk, 20 minutes, half an hour, how hard can that be, really? If you start doing that on a regular basis, you're going to decrease your risk. Add in a few extra food things, then you've reduced your risk as far as you can.
It's funny, as you describe all those points, it reminds me very much of the recommendations that have been going around for years for good heart cardiovascular health. It seems to be almost the same story. And I remember not that many years ago, some people were saying, you're suggesting that it's diabetes type 3. I heard some people refer to it as a cardiovascular disease. But as we now know, a lot of cardiovascular conditions are sugar diet related also.
Well, yes, no, maybe, really. But again, it's the underlying factor of, and this is what combines all of those conditions, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular diseases, is inflammation. So it's coming into the body in various ways, but primarily...
So it's going back to the old inflammation story.
This is the connection. So in a way, I kind of get a bit frustrated that we've got all these different disorders. We haven't really one of the disorder we have in our body is inflammation.
And it's manifesting as all these different conditions.
Absolutely. And so we've become really skillful at, it's almost like this reduction therapy we've got into in medicine, is that we've become really skillful at these really tiny little areas of specialty. Whereas if we were to all pull back a little bit and see the bigger picture and go, you know what, if we just prevented inflammation, so many of these things would not exist. So if we help people to work on that in the community, if we helped to spread better health messages and better education about how to cope with reducing inflammation in the body, you wouldn't develop into all these different, and can I say, end stage, incredibly expensive conditions. Because let's be really real here. Diabetes costs us a fortune. So does Alzheimer's, and so does cardiovascular disease. Think the money we'd save.
And also Alzheimer's is a really sad condition.
Yeah, it is. It's
very,
horrendous.
very upsetting.
It is. It is. It is absolutely awful for anyone who's affected, and all of their loved ones and everyone around it.
So yet again, it's the same old story. You know, exercise, good water, sleep, and a great diet. Just eat real food. That old mantra from way back.
Yeah, it is. But it's also about, you know, there are a couple of other things that are going around. I mean, it's considering the epigenetic stuff that we've talked about before. So, for example, if you are someone who has a problem with grains and gluten, then if you include those in your diet, they're going to increase your inflammation hugely, and they will impact your brain. So
that's going to be a disproportionate increase in the potential for problems if you have that predisposition.
Yes. So that's actually really going to affect your inflammatory potential. That's not going to affect everybody, but it will affect a lot of us. And also keeping in mind those, and we can't discount all those cognitive therapies that have always been out there and have been saying for a very long time how we can improve brain function through things like, and some of this, it seems really, really bizarre, but by really challenging our brain through things like learning a foreign language, doing things like crossword puzzles, playing chess. All of these activities actually challenge our brain in a way that actually not necessarily help to reduce the inflammation, but they keep the brain and they keep our neurons firing. And we have to remember that that's something also, that's almost like good brain health.
I can actually add something to that, something I heard about those very cognitive therapies. More so than therapies, the way they actually seem to work is if you do them when you're young and healthy, you lay down an excess of neural connections so that if you were to get a form of dementia of some sort, as those neurons are withered away because of the condition, you've still got enough to carry on comfortably. I remember hearing about, I think it was a group of Jewish people who had a particular cognitive therapy that meant they had an excess of neurons, and some of them, sure enough, did have Alzheimer's, but it wasn't identified until several years later than their contemporaries.
Right. I've not heard that.
Yeah, they just had an excess because they had done these things.
Right.
They had learnt a language. They had learnt a musical instrument.
Yeah.
They had learnt impromptu partner dancing.
Yeah.
It was having the excess of them, or growing extra ones. We know about neuroplasticity nowadays. Having more means that you've got stuff that can be withered away by the condition.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that would make sense. I've not actually read that, but that would make sense in terms of the things that I have read. I mean, for me as well, it's so important that you can actually put into your diet some really simple things. So thinking about the brain and the anti-inflammatory foods, I would be looking at using, lots of omega-3 fats. So that means, your oily fish or fish oil capsules or algae capsules, anything to get the omega-3s. Nuts and seeds will give you that as well. Anything in your diet that you can add that's going to decrease the inflammation and just very easily done. I mean, turmeric, there's so much research around turmeric these days that shows, and the clinical trials that have been showing how it reduces inflammation. So wherever it reduces inflammation in your body, it is going to reduce inflammation in the brain, and that's going to reduce your risk for Alzheimer's, and it's going to start reducing any symptoms that you have. So just remember, folks, it's inflammation, and we must reduce it.
Eat real food, eat real food, eat real food.
Yes. Are we sounding like we're a bit boring?
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to be a repetitious sort of mantra that we have. But
it will, but hopefully people will eventually get it, that, you know, if we can just control this, they'll see that actually this is at the basis. It really is at the basis of most of our disorders.
And we have to talk about each of these individual conditions to clarify that everything seems to be under the same umbrella.
Yeah, and if we didn't, we'd have only had one podcast.
But we've got plenty more topics to talk about. But is that pretty well it for this topic?
Yeah, I'm happy we've covered the essentials.
If you've got any questions, let us know specifically about this topic. We'd love to hear from you. There are plenty of ways of contacting us. One of the best, of course, is email, which is contact@carolinenutrition.com. You can also subscribe in iTunes or on your favourite podcatching app. Caroline's Twitter handle is @CJRScott, whereas mine is @IanCath. There's also a Facebook and a SoundCloud page which you can find. All of these links are available on the site at carolinenutrition.com. Drop on over. We'd love to hear from you, so let us know. And we do actually have a question from Sue. So, Caroline, Sue has said, is it a question? More a statement, I suppose. My dairy problem is basically solved now, and I only get an issue if I consume too much. When I saw you, was she a client of yours?
Yes.
I was taking between 2 and up to 4 antibiotics a day. Now I go weeks without taking any.
That's cool.
I have worked out that Up and Go is a big issue for me, and I used to drink it every morning in the car on the way to work for years. I think Up and Go is one of those Kellogg's or Uncle Toby's brand sort of liquid breakfast things, I think.
Yes, it is. Nasty, horrible.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it.
Shitty product.
Yeah, okay, so that she's been necking that stuff. Is it a dairy-based product?
Not dairy-based, but there's dairy in it. It's like a liquid porridge. Look, it's just awful. It's awful. It's in a cryovac pack and it's all those additives and preservatives and it's just rubbish. Let's stop eating that kind of stuff. We need to eat
a Tetra Pak, you mean?
Yeah, Tetra Pak, you're right.
Yeah. So, she said that she's feeling a lot better for having moved right away from dairy. She hasn't given it up completely by the sounds of it, but she's moved right away from it.
That's great to hear because I think for Sue, dairy was actually creating a lot of inflammation in her body. So the fact that we're able to remove pretty much most of that has reduced the inflammation. That's cool. Thanks, Sue.
And Tucker,
yes.
Are we doing this one?
Yeah.
And Tucker, did I hear you correctly? You hate canola oil. Could you explain why? Canola oil? You mean Canadian Oil Company who sell and produce a rapeseed oil. Wonder why they got rid of that name, hey? Rapeseed. I think it's still called rapeseed in the UK, but no.
It is.
Everywhere else they call it canola because it's so much nicer than rapeseed.
It's a very pretty yellow colour.
It's a beautiful flower.
It is lovely. Yeah. It looks gorgeous when all the fields are out and you've got this lovely stretch of yellow.
Keep it as a flower.
Tucker, the reason I don't like canola oil is it's really high in omega-6s. And omega-6s, we've discussed before, and if we haven't, we will, I'm sure, at a later date, are highly inflammatory in the body. So I think using those kind of created vegetable oils is really not a good idea for us.
But this isn't a created vegetable oil. This is a pure plant oil.
Yeah, but it's full of omega-6s. So it's in the body.
It's naturally.
Yeah, it's in the body. It creates an awful lot of inflammation.
Right. So this is a naturally occurring oil, plant oil that's nasty.
Yeah, and there's a few out. It's not so much that it's nasty; it just doesn't suit us as humans because it's going to create too much inflammation, and we all know what happens when we have inflammation. So. I think we're better off to find an oil and use an oil that is not high in omega-6s. So you want to look for the oils that are either monounsaturates, saturates, or omega-3s, but you can't cook with an omega-3. So you're really looking for the monounsaturated oils, so your olive oil, or you've got a coconut oil which is high in mono and saturates. Or you cook with a saturated oil, go back to the old-fashioned butter, duck fat, goose fat, lard, that type of thing. We need to come away from those vegetable oils that are high in omega-6s, and that's pretty much most of the vegetable oils that you'll find in the supermarket.
So if somebody was going out there to buy some oil for cooking, and they saw some rice bran oil, peanut oil, what am I thinking of, some other ones, sesame oil, whatever, they should do a quick search to see if they've got omega-6s in them.
Yeah, I don't think you'll find omega-6s listed on the nutrition label. You don't normally. They might list saturates, unsaturates, but it's a rule of thumb. You pretty much steer away from vegetable oils to cook with because they will be high in omega-6s, and you just want to understand the oils that are not. So, as I say, olive oil, avocado oil is good to cook with, macadamia oil, coconut, as I've said. This question comes up quite often when I'm presenting with clients.
Maybe we should do a detail show on oils at some stage.
Or cooking. Yeah, we could do that. But definitely it comes in the inflammatory basket, Tucker, and that's why I don't like using canola oil.
Well, thanks to Sue and Tucker for getting back to us. It's nice to have the start of some listener feedback. Thank you, and please send us more. We'd love to hear from you. The next episode, Caroline, what are we going to be talking about?
One of my favourites. Okay, so we're going to talk about sleep and how sleep affects us, or lack of sleep perhaps affects us. So I think a lot of us don't really understand the importance, and many of my clients think that we can get away with just a few hours sleep a night because they're supercharged and they think they're invincible. But I really want to talk about the science behind sleep and what is really happening when we're asleep. We think we're asleep, but are we asleep?
Excellent. Show us the recipe, Caroline.
Okay, so the recipe I came up with this time was, and in keeping with the idea of keeping high omega-3 fats, we're going to have a beautiful meal, and I'll write the recipe down for everyone, of salmon. If you can't get hold of wild caught salmon, then I'd suggest an oily fish like mackerel. Or even sardines, but mackerel perhaps, with some seasonal greens, broccoli, and a beautiful tahini dressing. So, as I say, high in the omega-3s, which is very anti-inflammatory for our brain. We'll all feel really supercharged after eating that.
And that's all for our good brain health, so that we have a really wonderful cognitive life, I suppose. All that recipe will be on the site at carolinenutrition.com. Check out the podcast over there. If you haven't subscribed, just do it. Thanks, everybody.
Are we done? That's it for this time. Okay.
We're out, Caroline. See you next time, eh?
Yep. See ya.